everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
API security is one of the areas that I think that we will see a lot more this year. I think just yesterday, a major provider talked about how, or they disclosed how an adversary was able to obtain data on like millions, multiple millions, something like 30 million customers through a single API. And I do think that this is one where we'll see in this year and in the coming years, there's more and more of a focus. Because usually when we talk about security, there's a number of things that we talk about, right? Around the endpoint security, network security, cloud security. I do think how applications are not just, protected in their deployment, but how they're protected in the development, and where I think API security, that's something that will become top of mind.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Liz Centoni, EVP, Chief Strategy Officer and General Manager of Applications at Cisco. Welcome to the show today.
Glad to be here, Scott.
I wonder if you could tell us about your role and some of the areas that you focus on.
Sure, happy to. Like you said, it's a few broad things under my charter today. But I've been at Cisco for 22 plus years. It'll be my 23rd year, mostly in engineering, doing development, and then, as general manager running certain businesses, I still oversee our applications business. I also have a team that looks at emerging tech and incubation, some more like in the next 12 to 18 months, others like quantum and things like decentralized identity, much more longer term. The team also works on some research projects as well. And working with the rest of our leadership team and other functional leaders, also help define our company strategy. So in a nutshell, that kind of covers the multiple things.
So I noticed that you're also working with startups and the venture communities. If you could share a little bit about how you're doing that.
So we work quite a bit. So I sit on our investment review board and have been doing that for the last 6 to 7 years, along with our corporate development team. And we invest in a number of startups. I would say, more than 100. We take LP positions in a few. And our focus is really around areas that are, kind of core to us and adjacent to us as well. So, to give you an example is security is an area that always has something new that props up, right? So in networking, mostly around automation and assurance, in full stack observability, we also look at themes like IoT is a theme, sustainability is a theme. For us, the whole idea is that, working with startups, it gives us an opportunity to look at what's out there in the market. Some of these companies we go to market with, there's a small portion of them that we actually acquire as well. But, acquiring the companies is a smaller, I would say, objective. Most of this is where I think we see ourselves as being part of the ecosystem in terms of enabling companies to kind of get to the next step. But we also want to do that kind of jointly, either co-create on the product side or co-create on the go-to-market side as well. Over the last couple of years, we've also focused on looking at, kind of more of the diversity and inclusion angle in our investment and working with startups as well.
I want to talk about some of the major trends in technology and business that you wanted to share with us, starting with the fact that we're in this always-on digital access to products and services. What should business be concerned with?
So I'll start with the experience, right? And a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart around what we often talk about as full stack observability. I think experience is going to be the metric or the KPI that every company that's out there is looking to sell their products and services via applications, right? So it's not just hey, I've got the brick and mortar store and then have an application, but I think application is going to be the forefront of the experience and kind of your loyalty from your end consumer as well. So I think the experience as a KPI is going to be a big issue or a big item. I think as when companies look at the experience, a couple of things that I would say is where I think the tie to security becomes very critical. So today, as a user of any application, I want the application to be simple. I want it seamless. I want to be able to know and have the trust that my credentials and my data are not going to be hacked. Right? So I think, and increasingly, when you look at how applications are developed, and how developers want the flexibility to be able to use services from anywhere. API security is one of the areas that I think that we will see a lot more this year. I think just yesterday, a major provider talked about or they disclosed how an adversary was able to obtain data on like millions, multiple millions, something like 30 million customers through a single API. And I do think that this is one where we'll see in this year and in the coming years, there's more and more of a focus. Because usually when we talk about security, there's a number of things that we talk about, right? Around the endpoint security, network security, cloud security. I do think how applications are not just, protected in their deployment, but how they're protected in the development, and where I think API security, that's something that will become top of mind. The second thing in that one, Scott, I would say is when we talk about experience, we've got to tie it to the business context. So what do I mean by that? Right? Today, when I talk to customers, you still get a lot of data that's coming at them. But you get these in silos. They get flags about, say, what's not working in my network, what's not working in my infrastructure, or in the application itself. But they get these different flags and events that pop up, but within that domain. And the question becomes is, what do I do with all this information? How do I get to a point where I'm able to address issues in real time? To do that, you need to be able to kind of correlate these across all of these environments and tie it to a business context, whether that business context is revenue issue, cost issue, kind of the end user experience issue. And I think we'll see more and more the conversation on tying this to a business context, because it's really about what do I need to address now? What can wait till later in terms of issues I need to address? So these are the two things I think we'll see, what I think that we'll hear more and more of a conversation and probably action on as well.
In the last 20 plus years that you've been at Cisco, you have seen security change dramatically. And certainly when it comes to the consumption or use of APIs, I think we're at a point where you could effectively create an entire experience together using either internal, but likely external party API services, and really create the experience layer, but the underlying capabilities, you're relying on somebody else. That's a very different model. And with that, to your point, there's a lot of intricacies and touch points that maybe not everyone has visibility into. So tell us, both on the receiving side of API, but also on the part of the vendor side, supplying that API service, what are some of the things that they can do as well in terms of increasing the API security aspects?
Yeah, so when I think about our own development teams, we want to give them flexibility to be able to say, it's no longer the day of where every service that you use needs to either be developed internally or by IT teams, et cetera. You want them to be able to have the flexibility to be able to go in and consume that service from anywhere, right? Which means you're pretty much, you don't want them to spend a whole bunch of time on, what you want is velocity to get your applications to market pretty fast. And the last thing that developers are thinking about is, or want to spend a whole bunch of time thinking about is this API secure, not just now when I'm actually in my CI/CD pipeline, but in deployment as well, right? And so that you pretty much leave hopefully to the SecOps team from a compliance and security standpoint. And so when you think about this is, I would say our developers are pretty disciplined in most ways in terms of saying, they're going to assume that whoever is providing that service, that API is secure. But I think gone are the days when we can just assume, right? And how do you not create a burden on the developers to have to think about, is my API secure through its entire life cycle? So this is where you think where API security becomes a bigger and bigger, becomes much more important, because I would like for where, we have a scoring of those APIs where my developers don't have to worry about it, and SecOps doesn't have to worry about the security and compliance, because I have a dynamic scoring that these APIs are secured through its entire life cycle. So part of this is where we, whether it's open source in terms of capabilities that we're leveraging or leveraging it from other companies, I think there's an assumption in terms of when we're leveraging it for companies other than open source that it will be secure. And I think that education needs to happen on the open source front around, again, understanding how these APIs are being used, and also around a focus around keeping those APIs secured through its life cycle, especially in open source when you have multiple people contributing to it. Like who are the guardians of making sure that it's secured through its life cycle? I think there's much more work to be done on that front. And I don't know if I have the answer to that, Scott, but the way we're looking at it is we don't want to assume that those APIs will be secure. We want to be able to discover those APIs in terms of what is being used, but also make sure that we have the tools and capabilities made available to our developers that help them speed up the development cycle, but also make sure that, we're dynamically checking for, are those APIs secure, right? What's the reputation of those APIs? Not just like I said, when we first, in the development lifecycle or in the development process, but through its entire life cycle as well.
First and foremost, on the open source, and there are a lot certainly when it comes to the different domain specific, where you have enterprises that's very much utilizing these things. But again, the nature of open source is that it's decentralized. It allows for contributors throughout the world to be able to add to that code base, whether it's on GitHub or something else. So that layer of security and some of the roles, responsibility, permissioning, that's a tough one to have oversight of, given the fact that it's an open source project. And then you also mentioned scoring, which is that it's not a scoring that's a point in time. It's not a snapshot, but it's an ongoing process that's measuring adaptability and the security of those API services. Can you talk just really briefly around the monitoring aspects and how real time that is?
So, one of the projects that we have going on right now is exactly this on API scoring, right? In the first, what we're looking at, it was interesting as we talked to our customers and as we were just testing out this tool, is the first aha moment was, boy, I didn't know that my team was using all these APIs, right? Both internally generated and what we're using from third parties, including open source as well. And the other one is more around the ability of the tool to do this dynamic score on the reputation of these APIs as well. And so I think that's the tool that's currently in development, Scott, that we should be out to market. And we put the first, I would say, beta version of that out there. But that's the tool that we currently have, where we believe the way to approach this is absolutely that, in terms of where we can provide SecOps a view of, here's what we, based on information that we're gathering, here's what we see as the reputation of this API. And SecOps can come in and either look at, what we need to address within that, or provide an alternative, kind of option to developers around that. I think the harder part in this, as we're looking at from, kind of how do we productize that API tool even better, we're calling it API Insights, is when, especially when you're using third party or open source, that probably is much more earlier in its life cycle than some of the other open source capabilities that are probably a lot more stable and have a lot more probably community contribution as well. So that's one of the projects that we're working on right now, because both we're internally using it within our own, kind of IT teams as well, as part of testing it out internally, as well as our own development tools, and a couple of other application teams within our company are using that as well.
And the other comment that I was going to mention is that I remember reading an article maybe sometime last year where the question was, if billions have been spent on security, and again, security is a very broad term, why have we not cracked the nut, so to speak? But I think the thing that that particular article was missing is that it's a moving target. Speaking of moving target, let's talk about post-quantum cryptography. What is it, and how is it different from quantum key distribution?
There's a few people on the team who are experts in this, and we went on and higher from that. Here's the way I look at it in terms of, from a strategy standpoint, right? When we talk about quantum, we've been talking about this for years. We've been always looking for the use case beyond where this goes from research to actually where we would put it in use. And quantum cryptography, when we looked at what's the problem that we're trying to solve, it's really about how we look at transmitting keys, right? And how that poses a fundamental risk. Because when you think about, the capabilities of what quantum can do is around how you can, what scares me is how much of that data can be harvested now and kept and to be decrypted later. Right? When I look at that problem statement, like you can harvest a whole bunch of keys and up until the time that you have the capability for it to be decrypted. So when you look at things like post-quantum cryptography, it seems like, at least to my eyes, more of a stopgap solution. It's unclear if, could it be in the possible like this PQC schemes could be broken in the future, right? And everything that I read and what I talk to the teams, they feel that level of, discomfort, saying that it could happen next year, it could happen the year after that. But what they feel a lot more solid about is where things like in a post-quantum world, it's like, how do we address this in a way where things like QKD could be potentially particularly impactful, because again, it avoids things that, things like PQC can do, where distribution of the keys over an insecure channel, right? So I think that's what we'll see more and more kind of the conversations about, because as I talked to customers before, when this sat mostly in probably a research team thinking about this, to where they're actually looking at adoption of things like QKD in IoT, in data centers, in some of the autonomous systems, et cetera. I still think that we need to take a few of these use cases and really, work through them. But I would say that's about the extent of my knowledge and expertise in that area. Because when I talk to the teams on this, it's fascinating, but I wish I had a magic 8-ball that says, can we say for certainty that, hey, things like a PQC is really a potential stopgap, because we've seen that it's actually these, you can give an examples, and maybe it's there today, of some of these schemes that have already been broken into, and hence, everybody moves more towards QKD because it avoids that distribution of keys over insecure channels, by the way.
I want to shift the conversation to responsible innovation. So you've shared a number of innovations that's happening within Cisco. Let's talk about AI. I think you've been pretty vocal about creating a framework that is private, public, government, academic, that really converges to figure out how to govern from an ethical and responsible manner. Can you talk about that framework?
We've been talking to our development teams, educating them on, some of the fundamentals around how you collect data, how you store that data, how your model is going to be used, the algorithms that you're writing, kind of things like model drift, the insights that have been gathering. Is that the original intent, right? So thinking about that responsibly, before, kind of going down that path as well, because security, privacy, copyright issues, ethical issues in terms of bias, where they're intended or unintended, that could come into this, right? I don't think this can be mandated. I think this, again, just like we talked about, on the open source side and API security, it needs a group of people thinking about like they're guardians of this galaxy to be able to come together and do that. And as we move from, AI that we use today to like the new buzz around generative AI, we'll get into bigger and bigger issues around things like copyright. Like, as much as you look at AI, for example, to spit out help for you to illustrate something, maybe you're writing your own book. I thought about that from a children's book standpoint. And then you have to look at that and go, well, that's generating that out based on stuff that's been fed in, that's prior art from someone else. So things around privacy, around copyright, I think this will become bigger and bigger. And I think more and more corporations, I would love for us to work together along with the industry, along with developers, to be able to put a framework out that's self-governed, not mandated from top down.
Can you tell us briefly about Cisco's global executive sponsor for the Women in Science and Engineering program?
Yeah, I would say is that, Cisco as a whole, when I look at our representation of women and kind of a diverse set of from an inclusion standpoint, we do a whole lot better than everyone in the industry, but that's still comparing to a model that's not good enough. So Women in Science and Engineering is one of our resource groups that brings together a community of the engineers where we look at, kind of sharing tips from everything from how you present to what are the domains that you want to look into, career advancement, but also paying it forward, right? As you rise in the organization as well. And also, how do you go even deeper when we talk about the pipeline issue of not enough women? We want to go even further back into high schools as well. So there's a number of things that we do more about, how do we, again, one, recruit more of the women into Cisco, but retain them and grow them, but also look to see as to how we can have a much more stronger pipeline coming in as well. And part of this is we also interact with other companies because there is no cookbook to how to do this really well. And hopefully one day we wouldn't be talking about it because it's not a problem anymore. We do this not just because it's the right thing to do, because it has shown that it actually has a positive impact to our business, to innovation.
So with that, I have been joined by Liz Centoni, EVP, Chief Strategy Officer and General Manager, Applications at Cisco. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.